My name is Liam Hunter, and at 59 years old, I watched my life's work get laughed at before the first course was even served. My stepson, Jax, didn't use a fist and knock me down. He used a piece of paper and a smirk that told me I was already a ghost in my own hallways. For a second, the room went cold. The retirement banner I'd hung myself fluttered in the draft. Drinks stayed frozen in midair. I looked at my wife, Sarah, waiting for her to say my name like it meant something. She didn't. She just reached out and adjusted a crooked dinner fork, obsessing over tables setting like the alignment of silver was a priority. Not the man she'd spent 20 years with. That was the moment the heat in me died out. Not a fire of anger, but something structural, something permanent. Lakeview, Illinois is where I built my reputation. 6 a.m. coffee at the lumber yard. Handshakes that act as contracts. I've lived by a craftsman's code. Measure twice, cut once, and never build on a foundation you haven't inspected yourself. At my age, your reputation is your retirement. And that's why the master suite mattered. It wasn't just a room, it was a promise. I hand-milled the cedar beams, spent weeks on my knees laying the Italian marble, and personally planed every inch of the molding until it was perfect. I did it with my own callous hands, because I wanted to give Sarah a sanctuary that would last 100 years. When we married, her second, my first, I put every cent and every ounce of my skill into her house until it was our house. Or so I thought. For years, I was the one who fixed the leaks, cleared the gutters, and kept the world out. I was a maintenance man who paid the mortgage and expected nothing but a seat at the table I'd built. I didn't realize that while I was checking the roof for rot, the people inside were termite mining the deed to my life. They thought they were evicting a tired contractor who had outlived his usefulness. They forgot one simple rule of construction. The man who knows how a house is built is the only one who knows exactly how to bring it down. 40 years is a long time to spend looking at the world through a level and a tape measure. In Lakeview, people knew if Liam Hunter built it, the seams wouldn't gap and the floors wouldn't groan, even after a half-century of winter. I started out swinging a framing hammer for $3 an hour, my knuckles constantly split and my lungs tasting like sawdust, all for a singular dream, to build a fortress that no one could take away. When I bought the Victorian on Elm Street, it was a skeleton, a hollowed-out ruin with rot in the sills and a roof that wept every time the clouds gathered. I spent my weekends and my nights under the hum of a work lamp, peeling back layers of decayed wallpaper and replacing structural beams that surrendered to time. I treated that house like a living thing. I didn't just install windows. I shimmed them until they moved with the whisper of a ghost. I didn't just lay hardwood. I hand-selected every plank of oak, matching the grain patterns, so the floor looked like a single, flowing river of gold. Sarah came into the picture when the house was nearly finished. She saw the craftsmanship, but I don't think she ever understood the cost. To her, the Victorian was a beautiful backdrop for her social life. To me, it was 40 years of skip vacations and aching joints. When we married, I felt a sense of completion. I brought her in. Then I brought Jax in, a teenager who looked at my tools like they were alien artifacts. I tried to teach him. I tried to show him how to find a stud, how to respect the wood, how to build something that outlasts your own breath. He just looked at his phone and waited for the weekend. I poured my final masterpiece into the master suite. It was my gift to the woman I thought had my back. I spent 6 months of my life in that room alone, hand-carving the mantelpiece from a single slab of black walnut I'd been seasoning in the shop for a decade. Every night, I'd come down to dinner with my hair white from wood dust, my back screaming, but I'd smile because the sanctuary was almost done. I was building a legacy, a physical manifestation of a hunter's word. I thought that by making the walls strong enough, I could protect the family inside from anything. I was so focused on the structural integrity of the house that I never bothered to check the foundation of my marriage. I gave them a sanctuary, and they used the silence I provided to sharpen the knife they eventually put in my back. They saw home. I saw 40 years of my life's blood. And as I stood there at that retirement dinner, I realized they hadn't just taken the house. They had stolen the man who built it. Jax moved back in 3 years ago, trailing a wake of vague excuses and unpaid debts that Sarah whispered away as bad luck. He arrived with 2 duffel bags and a sense of entitlement that didn't fit through the front door. At first, it was subtle. The way he'd leave his boots in the middle of the hallway I just buffed, or how he'd turn up the television until floorboards I'd hand screw began to vibrate. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that being a man meant providing a roof, even for a son who wasn't mine and didn't seem to like the person who provided it. But Jax wasn't just staying. He was colonizing. It started with the updates. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift to find Sarah had let him paint over the custom-stained wainscoting in the hallway with a flat, lifeless gray. "It's more modern, Liam," she'd say, not looking me in the eye, while Jack sat on the sofa I'd paid for, feet up, watching me like I was a hired hand who had overstayed his welcome. He began referring to the house as the property or Mom's place, carefully omitting my name from the narrative of the home I had resurrected from the dirt. Sarah's betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, steady erosion of my authority. She started asking me for signatures on what she called insurance updates and tax easements, always placing the papers in front of me when I was exhausted, my hands shaking from the day's labor. "Just some housekeeping, honey," she'd murmur. I trusted her because I thought we were a team, the architect and the administrator. I didn't realize she was actually the demolition crew. Jax grew bolder, his help around the house consisting of criticizing my work while he drained the fridge and the bank account. He'd mocked the blue-collar aesthetic of the Victorian, calling it a relic, while he secretly plotted to leverage the equity I'd built. They began having quiet conversations that stopped the moment I entered the kitchen, a heavy, cold silence that settled over the house like a thick layer of dust. I was the ghost in the machine, the man who kept the heat on and the water running while they practiced the lines for the play they were about to perform. I was so busy maintaining the structure that I didn't see them stripping the copper from the walls of our marriage. By the time the retirement dinner arrived, the house was already theirs in their minds. I was just the last piece of old furniture that needed to be hauled to the curb. The retirement dinner was supposed to be the victory lap for a marathon I'd been running since I was 19. I'd invited the guys from the local trade union, men with sandpaper hands and honest eyes who knew exactly what it took to keep a business upright for 4 decades. The table was set with a heavy linen Sarah usually kept for special guests. And for a few hours, I allowed myself to feel like the master of the house. I stood up to offer a toast, my glass raised to thank the people who had helped me build Lakeview, but I hadn't even cleared my throat before Jax's chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. "Sit down, Liam. You've done enough talking for one lifetime," Jax said, his voice cutting through the room like a jagged blade. The laughter died instantly. I looked at him, expecting a joke, but his eyes were flat and predatory. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across a mahogany table until it bumped against my plate. "Consider this your retirement gift. It's an eviction notice. You have 30 days to get your tools out of my house." The word hung in the air like poison gas. I looked at the paper, then at Sarah. "Sarah, what is this?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the sudden vacuum of the room. She didn't look up. She was staring at a singular, microscopic spot on her wine glass, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the position of a salad fork. She didn't deny it. She didn't scream at him to show some respect. She just sat there, her silence acting as the final signature on the document Jax had shoved in my face. "The deed was transferred to a family trust 3 years ago, Liam," Jax sneered, leaning back in the chair I had built. "And since I'm the sole trustee, I've decided the blue-collar aesthetic doesn't fit the new vision for this property. Mom agrees. You're a guest who's overstayed his welcome." I looked around the room, at the cedar beams I'd hand-milled, at the crown molding I'd sanded until my fingerprints were gone, and realized I was standing in a trap I'd spent 40 years perfecting. I waited for the surge of heat, the contractor's temper that had seen me through 1,000 difficult jobs. But it didn't come. Instead, a cold, clinical clarity settled over me. I looked at Sarah one last time, hoping for a flicker of the woman I'd married. But all I saw was a stranger who was more concerned with the settlement than the man who had provided it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up the envelope, tucked it under my arm, and walked out into the biting Illinois night. They thought they had taken my home. They didn't realize they had just released the only man who knew how to tear it down. I didn't go to a hotel that night. I drove to the one place that still felt like it had a heartbeat. My detached workshop at the edge of property. It was a cathedral of sawdust and steel, built with double-reinforced concrete and a climate control system better than the one in the main house. I needed to breathe, and I needed a plan. My plan was simple. I'd take the $60,000 I'd been squirreling away for a decade, my retirement shop fund, and I'd disappear. I had a vision of a small cabin in the mountains, a place where I could build furniture for myself and never have to look at a manila envelope again. That money wasn't in a bank account. I didn't trust digital numbers that could be wiped away by a keystroke. It was tied up in a specialized equipment fund, a high-yield brokerage account meant for industrial woodwork and machinery. And the physical backup was a set of bearer bonds and cash kept in a fireproof floor safe hidden beneath my heavy-duty table saw. I hauled the saw aside, the metal groaning against the floor. My hands were steady as I dialed the combination. I'd used these numbers for years. They were the dimensions of the first house I ever built. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. The safe was empty, not just of cash, but of the paperwork. The ledger was gone. The bonds were gone. In their place sat a single, folded receipt from a regional bank I didn't use. I sat back on my heels, the cold from the concrete seeping into my joints. I knew that feeling. It was the same feeling you get when you realize a load-bearing wall has shifted and the whole structure is about to pancake. I pulled up my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys. I logged into the brokerage portal with a password Sarah shouldn't have known. The balance read 14 cents. I scrolled through the transaction history. Over the last 18 months, the account had been bled dry, systematic withdrawals of $9,000 each, just enough to stay under the federal reporting thresholds. The signatures on the digital transfer forms were mine. Or rather, they were Liam Hunter, written with a distinctive loop on the L, that I'd spent 40 years signing on work orders. But the IP address for the transfers didn't match my shop computer. They originated from the main house, from Jax's gaming rig. I found a folder in the trash bin of the shared cloud drive. It contained scans of my signature from old building permits, meticulously cropped and cleaned up. It was a digital chop shop. They hadn't just stolen the house. They had harvested my identity to pay for Jax's gambling debts and Sarah's lifestyle upgrades. They had turned my own name into a crowbar and used it to pry open my future. I stood up and looked out the workshop window toward the main house. The lights were on in the master suite, the room I built as a sanctuary. I could see their shadows moving against the cedar beams I'd hand-milled. They thought they had finished me. They thought that by taking the money, they had taken my ability to fight back. But as a contractor, I know that money is just a tool, and tools can be replaced. What they didn't realize was that in their haste to drain the safe, they left behind the one thing that actually mattered. Tucked into the very back of the safe's lining was the original master deed and the unfiled building permits from 10 years ago. I looked at those permits and felt a cold, sharp smile touch my face for the first time in years. To the world, those papers looked like boring administrative clutter. To me, they were a blueprint for total destruction. I didn't need $60,000 to ruin them. I just needed to tell the truth to the right people. Jax wanted to be a property mogul? Fine. I was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to own a house that officially doesn't exist. The dawn didn't bring warmth, just a gray, unforgiving light that made the frost on my workshop windows look like shattered glass. I didn't sleep. I spent the early hours poring over the original blueprints and the unfiled permits I'd pulled from the back of the safe. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in a corner booth at a greasy spoon diner 3 towns over, waiting for Miller. Miller was a retired chief building inspector for the county, a man who smelled like old paper and menthol, and who knew every zoning loophole from here to Chicago. I pushed a manila envelope across the Formica table. I didn't tell him about the retirement dinner or the look on Sarah's face when she straightened that fork. I just told him the facts. The deed had been moved into a commercial family trust managed by my stepson, and I was being forced out. Miller put on his spectacles, his breath hitching as he scanned the transferred documents. "Liam," he said, tapping a section of the new deed with a yellowed fingernail. Did you know Jax registered this property as a Class B commercial holding under this Hunter Legacy Trust? I shook my head. I'd built the house, but I'd left the paperwork to the people I thought loved me. Miller let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like sandpaper. He's trying to avoid residential property taxes and use the house as collateral for a high-interest business loan. But he's a greedy idiot. He didn't check the zoning compatibility. In this county, when you flip a residential property to a commercial holding, the entire structure has to meet current commercial fire and safety codes. Not the code from when you built it, the codes from today. I felt a spark of something cold and sharp ignite in my chest. And the master suite, Miller? The one I finished last year. Miller flipped through my unfiled permits, the ones I'd never turned in because Sarah said she'd handle the city fees to save me the trip. He looked at my hand-drawn electrical schematics and the structural load-bearing calculations for the cedar beams. Then he looked at the commercial code book he kept in his briefcase. That suite is a masterpiece, Liam, but commercially speaking, it's a death trap, Miller said. The wiring is residential grade. The insulation isn't fire-rated for a business structure. And those beautiful hand-milled beams? They haven't been pressure-treated with flame retardant. By moving this into a commercial trust, Jax just turned your best work into a massive, uninsured legal liability. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. If the city finds out, they won't just fine him. They'll issue a stop-use order and pull the certificate of occupancy. The bank will call the loan immediately because the collateral is technically illegal. He can't sell it. He can't rent it. And he sure as hell can't live in it. I leaned back, the weight of 40 years of labor finally feeling like a weapon instead of a burden. Jax had wanted the house because he saw it as an ATM, a way to cash out my sweat and blood to pay for his failures. He thought he was stealing a palace. He didn't realize he was stealing a ticking time bomb of code violations and tax fraud. What happens if someone reports an anonymous tip about unpermitted commercial renovations? I asked. Miller looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw him smile. The city sends out an enforcement team within 48 hours. They'll strip the walls to the studs to verify the wiring. They'll condemn the suite first, then the whole floor. I thanked Miller and paid for his breakfast. As I walked back to my truck, I felt a strange, quiet peace. For years, I had built things to stand forever. I had reinforced every joint and leveled every beam to ensure Sarah and Jax were safe. I had been their foundation. But Jax had decided to change the rules of the game. He wanted to play in a world of commercial contracts and legal fine print, a world where my calloused hands didn't matter, but my signature did. He thought he had humiliated me by kicking me out of my own home. He didn't realize that by taking my name in my house, he'd also taken the only person who was keeping the ceiling from falling on his head. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't call Jax. I called the city building department's anonymous tip line. I knew exactly which fault lines to describe. I knew which wires were tucked behind the cedar and which beams would fail a commercial stress test. I was a master builder, after all. And today, I was going to show them exactly how much it costs to demolish a man's life. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. In my line of work, if you leave a structural flaw exposed for too long, the whole project collapses on you. I spent the next morning at the precinct, sitting across from a detective who looked like he'd seen every kind of betrayal a city could offer. I laid out the digital breadcrumbs Jax had left behind, the crop signatures, the IP addresses from the house, and the empty safe where my future used to live. Reporting your own wife for forgery feels like pulling a load-bearing wall out from under your heart. But as I watched the detective's pen move, I realized I wasn't destroying a family. I was clearing away the rot. By noon, the second phase of the deconstruction began. I stood across the street from the Victorian, sitting in my truck with a thermos of black coffee, watching as the city enforcement SUV pulled into the driveway. 2 inspectors hopped out, clutching clipboards and wearing the kind of expression that spells financial ruin for a property owner. They didn't knock with a polite greeting. They knocked with the authority of the municipal code. I saw Jax open the door, his chest puffed out, likely prepared to brag about his commercial holding. But as they stepped past him and headed straight for the master suite, His posture began to wilt. From my vantage point, I could see the flash of their high-intensity work lights through the cedar-framed windows. They were doing exactly what Miller said they'd do, tracing the residential-grade wiring I'd documented in my tip. They were checking the fire ratings on the insulation. They were finding every shortcut Jax and Sarah had forced me to take by refusing to pay for the proper permits. Within 2 hours, a bright orange notice of violation was slapped onto the front door, the very door I had hung and leveled with such pride. The house was now legally flagged. Because it was tied to a commercial trust under investigation for fraud and safety violations, the property was effectively frozen. Jax couldn't sell it to cover his gambling debts, and he couldn't use it as collateral for a new loan. In the eyes of the law, the house had become a liability instead of an asset. It was in legal probate, a ghost ship anchored in a sea of red tape. The phone call started 10 minutes after the inspectors left. Sarah's name flashed on my screen 6 times. I let it ring. Then came Jax, his voice leaving a frantic, screaming voicemail about betrayal and ruining the family legacy. I listened to it twice, marveling at the irony. He talked about legacy while standing in a house he'd stolen, under a roof I'd built, using a name he'd forged. I drove to the bank that held the trust's secondary loan, the one Jax had been counting on to bail him out. I didn't go in to argue. I went in hand to deliver a copy of the police report and the city's condemnation notice. I watched the teller's face go pale as she realized the collateral for their 6-figure loan was now a flag crime scene with no certificate of occupancy. Standing on the sidewalk outside the bank, I felt my name coming back to me. For years, Liam Hunter had been a signature at the bottom of a check or a voice saying yes to whatever Sarah wanted. Now my name was a wall. It was a stop work order on their greed. I had spent 40 years building sanctuaries for people who didn't deserve them. Now, I was using that same expertise to dismantle their illusions. I wasn't just taking back a house. I was taking back the right to be the only person who decided what my life was worth. The Victorian was a shell, Jax was a fraud, and for the first time in a decade, the foundation under my feet felt perfectly, beautifully level. The final settlement wasn't a victory of numbers, but a victory of truth. When the dust from the building inspections and the fraud investigations finally settled, the Victorian house on Elm Street was no longer a home or a commercial holding. It was a liability that Jax and Sarah couldn't carry. The bank moved in, the trust collapsed, and the family legacy they tried to build on a foundation of theft was liquidated to pay off the fines and the siphoned funds they owed. I didn't take the house back. I didn't want the memories of that dinner party or the ghost of a marriage that was never level. I took my tools, my remaining pride, and a modest settlement from the forced sale of the property. I drove west until the air changed, until the smell of suburban exhaust was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth. I found a small cabin in the Colorado foothills, a place that hadn't seen a paintbrush or a level in 30 years. It was modest. 4 walls of hand-hewn logs and a roof that needed a man who knew how to handle a hammer. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't building a sanctuary for someone who would eventually lock me out of it. I was building a life for a man who finally knew his own worth. My new workshop is smaller than the cathedral of steel I left behind, but the light hits the workbench just right in the afternoons. I spent the first month doing the maintenance I'd always done, but this time, the quiet was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of Lakeview, where I had to walk on eggshells to keep from upsetting the peace. It was the silence of a job done right. I replaced the subflooring, reinforced the joists, and installed a wood-burning stove that throws a steady, honest heat. I heard through a friend that Jax is working a retail job back in Illinois, living in a cramped apartment, and still trying to blame the system for his downfall. Sarah reached out once, a long, rambling email about forgiveness and moving past the misunderstandings. I didn't reply, not because I'm angry, but because I've learned that you can't fix a structure once the dry rot has reached the core. You have to tear it down and start over on fresh ground. Every evening, I sit on the porch I built with my own 2 hands. I don't have a walnut chair anymore. I built myself a new one out of local white oak. It's sturdy, it's plumb, and it doesn't squeak. I sit there and watch the sun dip behind the peaks, my callous hands resting on the arms of the chair. I'm 59 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm not the maintenance man for someone else's dreams. I'm the architect of my own peace. People ask if I'm lonely up here. I tell them that being alone is a choice. Being lonely is what happens when you're surrounded by people who don't see you. I look at my tools, hanging in their proper places, and I realize that a name isn't something you sign on a document. It's something you earn through the work you do when no one is watching. My name is Liam Hunter, and my foundation has never been stronger. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.